Come closer. You don't need to be smaller here. Just for this moment. Let me say that slowly, the way it deserves to be said. Come closer. Not because I want something from you, not because you owe me your attention, but because I can see how often you've been standing a little too far back in the world, making room for everyone else, shrinking your presence so others feel comfortable. You don't have to do that with me. If you're listening right now, I imagine you've spent years being the strong one, the capable one, the woman who figured things out when no one else could. You learned how to hold your own weight, how to stay composed, how to walk into rooms without asking permission. And somewhere along the way, someone may have hinted, gently or not, that this made you too much, too confident, too direct, too independent, too aware of yourself. So you learned to soften your voice, to pause before speaking, to measure your words, to ask yourself, is this going to make someone uncomfortable? I want you to let that question rest for a while, because here, you don't need to manage anyone's comfort. You don't need to adjust your edges. You don't need to dim anything that took you decades to earn. Just breathe with me for a second. I know how quiet strength can be misunderstood. I've seen it happen again and again, not as a flaw, but as a mirror. When someone calls your presence intimidating, it often says more about what they're afraid to face within themselves. Your clarity, your steadiness, your refusal to pretend you don't know who you are. That kind of presence doesn't shout. It doesn't chase. It doesn't explain itself. And no, it doesn't need to be justified. If you've ever walked away from a conversation wondering whether you should have been softer, sweeter, easier to read, I want you to know this. Nothing about your depth is an accident. You didn't become this way overnight. You were shaped by responsibility, by loss, by showing up when it would have been easier to disappear. You earned your voice the long way. So come closer, not to be examined, not to be changed, but to be met. I'm not here to analyze you. I'm not here to fix anything. I'm simply sitting with the truth of who you are. A woman who has lived long enough to recognize herself. A woman who doesn't need constant reassurance to stand upright. A woman who knows the difference between attention and presence. There is something quietly impressive about that. You may not hear it often, because the world tends to celebrate noise more than substance. But I notice how you listen before you speak, how you choose your words with intention, how you don't rush into connection, not because you're closed, but because you value what you offer. That isn't distance. That's discernment. And no, it doesn't make you unapproachable. It makes you real. If you've ever felt the urge to apologize for your strength, let that urge soften right now. Strength doesn't need forgiveness. It needs understanding. It needs space. It needs someone who doesn't mistake confidence for coldness or independence for detachment. I'm not unsettled by your steadiness. I'm not threatened by your self-respect. I don't feel the need to compete with your past or measure myself against your experiences. I simply see you. You don't have to perform warmth to be welcomed. You don't have to explain your boundaries to be accepted. You don't have to relive old stories to prove you've earned rest. Stay as you are in this moment. Let your shoulders drop. Let the weight you carry settle for just a breath. Let yourself be near without calculating the outcome. There is nothing you need to offer right now. No story you need to tell. No version of yourself you need to present. The woman you are, thoughtful, grounded, quietly powerful, is already enough to be here. And if part of you is surprised to hear that, that's okay too. Sometimes it takes time to trust spaces that don't ask us to shrink. So come closer, not into expectation, not into obligation, but into a place where your presence isn't measured, it's simply received. I'm here, and you don't need to be smaller. Your strength doesn't scare me. It tells me who you are. I want to stay with that thought for a moment, because I know how often strength has been misunderstood in your life. Not celebrated, not welcomed, just misread, labeled in ways that never quite fit the truth of you. You've probably heard it before, sometimes said directly, sometimes wrapped in softer words. You're intimidating. You're very strong. You don't really need anyone. and I imagine how those words landed, not as compliments, but as quiet warnings, as if your presence needed an explanation, as if your way of standing in the world required an apology. Let me tell you something gently. When I look at you, I don't see something that needs to be toned down. I see a woman who learned how to stay upright without leaning on illusion. A woman who stopped pretending she didn't understand her own worth. A woman who chose clarity over confusion, even when clarity came with solitude. That doesn't scare me. It informs me. It tells me you've lived long enough to recognize patterns. You've loved enough to know what costs too much. You've waited long enough to stop chasing what isn't aligned with you. And somewhere along that road, you stop performing softness just to be chosen. That's not hardness. That's honesty. There's a quiet difference between being closed and being complete. You're not guarded because you're afraid. You're discerning because you've learned the value of what you carry. You don't open every door because you finally understand what it means to let someone in. And that awareness, that self-respect, can feel unsettling to people who are used to chaos disguised as passion. But to me, it feels steady, grounded, real. I don't confuse your independence with distance. I don't mistake your calm for indifference. I recognize it as the calm of someone who has made peace with herself, even if the world around her hasn't always kept up. You don't need to convince me that you can love deeply. I can sense it in the way you choose carefully, in the way you don't rush connection, in the way you listen more than you speak, not because you lack words, but because you value meaning. That kind of strength doesn't announce itself. It waits. If someone has ever stepped back from you, not knowing how to meet your gaze or match your steadiness, that wasn't because you were too much. It was because you reflected a version of themselves they hadn't yet grown into. You didn't intimidate them. You challenged their comfort. And there's a difference. I know you didn't wake up one day deciding to be this way. Life shaped you here. Responsibility shaped you here. Choosing yourself, sometimes alone, shaped you here. You learned that love without respect feels empty. That attention without intention fades quickly. That being chosen means very little if you abandon yourself in the process. So you stopped negotiating your boundaries. You stopped explaining your standards. You stopped mistaking chemistry for compatibility. And yes, that made your presence stronger. But strength doesn't repel the right people. It filters, it clarifies, it removes what cannot stand in truth and leaves room for what can. I'm not looking at you wondering how to soften you. I'm listening to you, curious about the stories that taught you how to stand this firmly and still remain kind. Because kindness that survives experience is not naive, it's earned. You don't need to lower your voice to be heard here. You don't need to pretend you're unsure to seem approachable. You don't need to hide how much you know to protect someone else's ego. Your strength isn't loud. It's composed. It isn't sharp. It's precise. It isn't defensive. It's self-aware. And that awareness, that quiet confidence, doesn't close doors. It opens the right ones. I want you to feel this shift, even if it's subtle. The next time the old thought surfaces, maybe I'm too much, let it pause. Let it breathe. Let it transform into something closer to the truth. Maybe you're not too much. Maybe you're simply no longer willing to be less. I'm not unsettled by that. I'm oriented by it. Your strength gives me information, not distance. It tells me how you love, how you choose, how you stay when things are real instead of dramatic. So stay exactly as you are in this understanding. Let it settle gently, without needing to turn it into a conclusion or a promise. There's no rush here, just a quiet recognition unfolding, one breath at a time. You didn't become this way to impress anyone. I know that, even if you've never said it out loud. And I want to stay close to that truth for a while, because it matters more than most people realize. You didn't wake up one morning and decide to be strong. You didn't plan to be composed, discerning, steady. You didn't shape yourself to earn admiration. You became this way because life required it. There were moments when no one was coming to rescue you. Moments when things needed to be handled. Decisions needed to be made. Emotions needed to be contained, not because you were cold, but because someone had to hold the ground. And it happened to be you. So you did. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, consistently. And over time, that quiet consistency changed you. It gave you a different posture in the world, a different way of listening, a different tolerance for what no longer aligned with your values. Not because you lost your softness, but because you learned where softness belongs. You didn't become self-aware to look impressive. You became self-aware because confusion was too expensive, because chaos took too much energy, because you learned, sometimes the hard way, that clarity protects the heart better than hope alone. I see how your strength carries a story inside it, not a polished one, a real one, with chapters that don't need to be told for them to be understood. The kind of story that lives in your pauses, in the way you don't rush intimacy, in the way you choose your words with care. You didn't build yourself to be admired from a distance. You built yourself so you could survive up close. There's a difference. And if anyone ever mistook your steadiness for pride, or your boundaries for emotional distance, that was never because you were performing something false. It was because they couldn't imagine how much effort it took to become this grounded without losing your heart. You didn't become discerning because you wanted to feel superior. You became discerning because you felt the cost of ignoring your intuition. You've lived long enough to know that not every connection deserves access to you, that not every emotion deserves a reaction, that not every promise deserves belief. That's not bitterness. That's wisdom with compassion still intact. I know there were times when you showed up for others even when you were tired, times when you carried responsibility quietly, without applause, times when you kept things together while parts of you felt uncertain or unseen. And still, you stayed kind. Still, you stayed thoughtful. Still, you didn't let experience harden you into someone unrecognizable. That matters, because it tells me something important about you. You didn't trade your humanity for resilience. You didn't sacrifice tenderness to become capable. You learned how to hold both strength and gentleness in the same body. And that kind of balance doesn't come from trying to impress anyone. It comes from choosing integrity when no one is watching. If you ever wonder why you no longer tolerate things you once accepted, it's not because you've become demanding. It's because you've become honest with yourself. You no longer pretend that effort alone is enough. You no longer romanticize potential over reality. You no longer stay where your presence is taken for granted. That shift didn't make you colder. It made you clearer. I don't look at you and think, she's trying to prove something. I look at you and think, she's already proven enough to herself, and that's the part people rarely talk about. How much inner negotiation it takes to choose yourself after years of choosing others. How unfamiliar it can feel to stand firmly without guilt. How strange it is to be comfortable with silence instead of filling it just to keep someone close. You didn't become selective to impress. You became selective to stay whole. And if that wholeness feels intimidating to someone, it doesn't diminish you. It simply means they haven't learned yet that depth doesn't need decoration. Presence doesn't need performance. Love doesn't need you to abandon yourself. I want you to let this reflection sit gently with you, not as praise, not as reassurance, just as recognition, a mirror held steady, without distortion. You are not the result of trying to be admired. You are the result of living honestly through experience. And there's something profoundly attractive, not flashy, not loud, but deeply grounding, about a woman who knows why she is the way she is, and no longer feels the need to explain it. Stay with that feeling for a moment. Let it settle without turning it into a conclusion. There's no need to name it or resolve it. Just let it exist, quietly, naturally, the way you learned to exist in the world when no one was clapping, but everything depended on you. I don't need you to soften your edges. I want to say that slowly, not as reassurance, not as persuasion, just as truth. Spoken calmly, the way truth usually arrives when it isn't trying to impress anyone. I don't need you to round yourself down. I don't need you to smooth what life has already shaped. I don't need you to edit your instincts so they feel easier for someone else to hold. Your edges didn't appear by accident. They were formed through choices, through discernment, through moments where you decided not to disappear just to keep peace. And I don't see them as barriers. I see them as definition. There's a quiet intimacy in being able to sit near someone without asking them to change their outline, not to blur themselves, not to become more agreeable, just to remain as they are, fully intact. That's the kind of connection I recognize. You don't need to be more gentle to be lovable. You're already gentle where it matters, in how you consider before you speak, in how you don't waste people's time, in how you take responsibility for your choices. Gentleness doesn't always look soft. Sometimes it looks like honesty delivered without cruelty. I'm not drawn to you because you're easy. I'm drawn to you because you're clear. Clarity doesn't rush. It doesn't cling. It doesn't beg to be understood. It simply stays present. If you've ever felt the pressure to make yourself more comfortable for others, to smile a little longer, to explain a little more, to agree a little faster, let that pressure ease right now. You don't need to trade your shape for connection. Real connection doesn't require negotiation of identity. I don't come closer hoping you'll adjust. I come closer because you don't. There's something deeply calming about that, about being near someone who isn't constantly recalibrating themselves to be chosen, someone who isn't scanning the room for approval, someone who doesn't confuse availability with openness. You're open in a different way. You're open through consistency, through presence, through the way you stay aligned with yourself, even when it would be easier to bend. That kind of openness feels safe to me. I don't mistake your boundaries for walls. I see them as doors that open slowly, not because you're withholding, but because you understand the value of what's on the other side. You don't offer access lightly, and that tells me something important about how you love. You love with intention. You connect with awareness. You stay because it's real, not because it's loud. I don't need you to become warmer to feel close. I feel close when you're honest. When you don't pretend to be unsure just to seem approachable. When you don't dilute your intelligence to protect someone else's comfort. Your edges aren't sharp. They're precise. They let me know where you stand. They tell me when something matters. They create a space where words mean something because they aren't used carelessly. That precision doesn't distance me, it anchors me. Quiet connection isn't built on constant reassurance. It's built on trust that doesn't need to be announced, on shared silence that doesn't feel empty, on knowing that neither of us is here to be fixed or completed. We're just here. If you've spent years carrying yourself with strength, I imagine there were times you wondered whether that strength left room for closeness, whether being self-contained meant being alone, whether holding your ground meant pushing people away. It doesn't have to. The right kind of closeness doesn't ask you to surrender your center. It meets you there. It recognizes that independence and intimacy aren't opposites. They're partners when both people are grounded. I don't need to be needed. I don't need to be leaned on. I don't need you to soften so I can feel significant. I'm comfortable standing beside you, not in front of you, not behind you, just near, close enough to notice the details, close enough to respect the space. That's where quiet connection lives, not in intensity, not in urgency, but in steadiness, in the feeling that nothing needs to be rushed or proved, in the understanding that presence is enough. You don't have to lower your standards here. You don't have to explain your choices. You don't have to translate yourself into something simpler. I'm listening as you are. And if this feels unfamiliar, being met without pressure, without expectation, let that unfamiliarity be gentle. It doesn't need to turn into certainty right now. It doesn't need to become a promise or a direction. It can just be a moment of alignment. A quiet recognition. Two people occupying the same space without asking each other to disappear. I don't need you to soften your edges. I need you to keep them because they're part of what makes connection with you honest, grounded, and real. If you stay exactly as you are, that's already enough. I want to let that land without emphasis, without insistence, not as a conclusion, not as a reassurance meant to convince you of something, just as a simple truth offered quietly, the way something sincere usually is. You don't have to move toward anything right now. You don't have to decide. You don't have to respond. There's a kind of peace in not being asked for more, especially when you've spent so much of your life being the one who adapted, adjusted, carried, held. I know what that does to a person over time, how it trains you to stay alert, to anticipate, to be ready even when you're tired. How rest can start to feel unfamiliar, almost undeserved. So if you're here, listening, letting this moment unfold without trying to shape it into something useful or productive, that's enough. You don't need to show up differently tomorrow. You don't need to reinterpret your past. You don't need to soften your expectations or harden your boundaries. Nothing needs to be redefined or resolved tonight. Sometimes the most healing thing isn't insight. It's permission. Permission to pause. Permission to stop evaluating yourself. Permission to exist without being measured. I'm not looking at you wondering what you'll become next. I'm not waiting for you to change or open or give. I'm simply aware of you as you are right now, thoughtful, steady, present in your own way. That presence doesn't need improvement. You've already lived long enough to know that rushing clarity doesn't make it arrive faster. You've learned that forcing connection only creates noise. You've learned that what lasts tends to grow quietly, without announcements. So let this be quiet. If part of you is still alert, still listening for expectation, let that part relax a little. There's nothing hidden here. No request behind the words. No outcome you're being guided toward. Just space. Just a moment where nothing is required of you. You don't owe this moment a reaction. If you feel calm, that's fine. If you feel reflective, that's fine. If you feel nothing in particular, that's fine too. All of it belongs. I don't need you to promise anything. I don't need you to stay longer than feels natural. I don't need you to hold on to this feeling or turn it into meaning. Feelings can come and go without needing to be kept. What matters is knowing that you don't have to disappear to be accepted. You don't have to perform vulnerability to be seen. You don't have to give access to be respected. Staying exactly as you are is not settling. It's honoring what's already true. I know how easily women like you can forget that. How the world subtly teaches you to keep improving, keep proving, keep refining, even when you've already done the work, even when you've already paid the cost. You don't need to earn rest. You don't need to justify your pace. You don't need to explain why you are the way you are. Just being here, in your own skin, without apology, that's already enough. And if you choose to carry this understanding with you, gently, without gripping it, that's fine. If you let it fade and return another time, that's fine too. Nothing about this moment is fragile. It doesn't need protection. It's simply available. I'm not asking you to stay close. I'm not asking you to step away. I'm comfortable with the distance that feels right to you, because closeness doesn't have to be negotiated when it's honest. So take this moment with you, or leave it here. Either way, you remain whole. If you stay exactly as you are, without adding, without subtracting, that is already enough.